Winnipeg. I want to thank all of you for coming here tonight and making this evening another successful part of George Galloway's Canadian tour. I want to thank the national organizers of the tour for making tonight possible. And the national organizers are the Canadian Peace Alliance, the Canadian Vote to Gaza, Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, the Canadian Arab Federation, and Independent Jewish Voices. I also want to thank all the local organizations who worked so hard for tonight's meeting. It was truly an effort that mobilized the community in Winnipeg and extended beyond the city to include organizations in Brandon. And thanks to Independent Jewish Voices Winnipeg, Canada-Palestine Support Network Winnipeg, Students Against Israeli Apartheid, University of Manitoba, Canadian Federation of Students, Manitoba, Council of Canadians, Winnipeg, the Uniter, the Institute for Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Winnipeg, CKUW FM 95.9, the Brandon NDP Women's Association, the Mondragon Bookstore and Coffee House, Winnipeg Labour Council, Brandon and District Labour Council, Manitoba Peace Council, the War Resisters Support Campaign Winnipeg, the Keep Resistors in Canada Campaign, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And last, I'd also like to thank Broadway Disciples United Church for their help in providing us with what we need. And thanks to Sarah, who is working the sound tonight and was most helpful in showing us the place and helping us organize it. And just prior to introducing Mr. Galloway, we will hear very briefly from three of the local organizations which have been working to break through what is often a very one-sided discussion in Canadian political life about the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So, as first speaker, I'd like to call on Daniel Tal-Elef, representing Independent Jewish Voices.
Thanks very much. Independent Jewish Voices was founded in 2008 to provide a Jewish voice all the way across Canada with a strong commitment to social justice, universal human rights, and strongly opposed to racism and oppression. At the local level, we've organized together with Peace Alliance Winnipeg and Canada-Palestine Support Network and a number of other local groups. Often University of Manitoba Department of Labor Studies is very supportive. We've organized public speaking engagements by Jeff Halper of Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, Mark Ellis, the theologian, Michael Kiefer on his recent tour. We brought in Mordechai Greenberg of Seriously Free Speech Committee as part of Israeli Apartheid Week at the University of Manitoba last year. And we've endorsed numerous other speakers in public demonstrations. At the national level, Independent Jewish Voices supported the United Church of Canada's effort to pass a boycott, divestment, sanctions resolution. We sponsored a solidarity tour to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories this past summer, and we're supporting the efforts to send a Canadian ship as part of the next Freedom Flotilla, trying to break the siege on Gaza this coming spring. Independent Jewish Voices also recently released a video, and we were quoted in the Globe and Mail opposing the Canadian Parliamentary Coalition to Combat Anti-Semitism and its international equivalent, pointing out that these forums really have nothing to do with anti-Semitism, but they are in fact using the accusation of anti-Semitism to silence criticism of the State of Israel. The banning of George Galloway from entering Canada earlier this year should not be seen as an isolated incident, but as part of a concerted effort by this Conservative government in Canada to support the State of Israel unconditionally, including support of its ongoing oppression of the Palestinian people. The Canadian government also is actively participating in that oppression by cutting off aid to Gaza and through other ways. And this is part of their push to intimidate and possibly criminalize anyone who speaks opposition to this policy of unconditional support. As always, Independent Jewish Voices is proud to be working with the partner organizations that Glenn just listed, both locally and nationally, and we're proud to be a part of bringing George Galloway to speak here in Winnipeg. Thank you.
next speaker, I'll call on Brian Latour, representing Students Against Israeli Apartheid at the University of Manitoba.
Hi folks, I'm here, Students Against Israeli Apartheid. We're a student group at the University of Manitoba. We were formed kind of out of the folks who got together to organize Israeli Apartheid Week back in March. We decided to form a student group to kind of carry on the work into the future. The biggest thing we're gearing up for in the near future is planning for Israeli Apartheid Week 2011. We've already got some really good speakers lined up, so it should be a really good event, and we'd love to have anyone's support on that. We're looking to, always as groups are always looking to increase our membership and expand, so students, not even just students at the U of M, students at the U of W, anyone who's interested can come by, check out our table, sign up, take some literature, get our contact info. There's lots of opposition on campus these days to discussing Israeli apartheid. There's been attempts to ban our events last year. There probably will be attempts to ban our events this year. We're trying to, we're going to have Israeli Apartheid Week at the U of W next year, even though, Lloyd Axworthy said in the past that Israeli Apartheid Week would never happen at the U of W, but we aim to prove him wrong. Lloyd. We're going to need some community support on that. So if keep your ear to the ground if you start hearing about attempts to ban IAW, we'd love to have messages of support whenever that whole kerfuffle starts happening next year. And I'd just like to say, if you're interested in our student group, if you know somebody, we're looking to expand to the UW as well, so check out our table. Thanks.
And finally, I'd like to ask Bassam Hosema, representing the Canada-Palestine Support Network.
Well, thank you, and it's awesome to see the number of people that are out here. I don't know how many times I told Glenn that the peace movement needs a hero, a living, vital hero. Someone to do for the peace movement what David Suzuki has done for the environmentalist movement, and I think you may have found one, not too far out of one, in Mr. Galloway. And so on behalf of CanPalNet, Canada-Palestine Support Network here in Winnipeg, I'd like to say thank you to everyone here and to Mr. Galloway for joining us. He's in the back here in the audience. And Canada-Palestine Support Network, we do some work here in Winnipeg, working with a lot of the groups that have been mentioned today. IJB, Students Against Israeli Apartheid, IAW, the Israeli Anti-Apartheid Week at the University of Manitoba, hopefully at the University of Winnipeg soon. We try to raise awareness of the Palestinian side of the issue, we bring in speakers, and we hold educational events and other forums that try to put forth the Palestinian side of the story and to correct some of the misconceptions that are being perpetuated by our federal government, amongst others. It's not easy work, and it's good to see people out here to events like this, but I'd like to see people being more involved, being more engaged in what's going on. When they hear something, when they hear our Prime Minister standing up and saying, while Israel's bombing the hell out of Gaza, standing up and saying that Israel is using restraint and that Israel has a right to defend itself. I'd like to see every one of us here stand up and say, no, that's not true. Israel's the aggressor. And yeah, it's good to see people out here, and I'd really like to see more people involved in what's going on. Thank you.
You know, it's my honor and my pleasure to introduce George Galloway, and to begin with, I'll just provide you some background to his lifelong commitment to human rights and social progress. I'm sure you all know that Mr. Galloway is a distinguished British politician, author, and broadcaster. He was elected to office in 5 general elections and sat as an MP for almost 25 years, both as a member of the Labour Party and later for the Respect Party, of which he was a founding member. From 1983 to 1987, he was General Secretary of War on Want, a British charity that campaigns against poverty worldwide. He is known internationally for his stands against the 2 Iraq wars and the war in Afghanistan. He opposed sanctions against Iraq, and in 1998 founded the Merriam Appeal, which campaigned against the disastrous consequences sanctions had on the ordinary people of Iraq. In 2005, in testimony in front of a U.S. Senate committee, he turned allegations against him into a stinging rebuke of U.S. foreign policy. Mr. Galloway is also known for his support for the people of Palestine, a cause which he has supported since 1974. In response to the 2008-2009 Israeli bombardment of Gaza, Mr. Galloway initiated the Viva Palestina aid convoy to the Gaza Strip, which raised and delivered over £1 million worth of humanitarian aid, including ambulances, wheelchairs, incubators, medical supplies, school supplies, food, fresh water, clothing, and toys. And in 2010, he struck a blow for free speech in Canada when, as he promised in 2009, he would fight to overturn the Canadian government's decision preventing him from entering Canada. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. George Galloway. This is a gift from Mr. Galloway from the people of Winnipeg, and of course all of you assembled here today. It is a Métis sash, and it is really symbolic of a struggle of the Métis people here and their fight for self-determination against all the injustices of the Canadian state against them. And it's a struggle which goes on today and is by and large a measure of what kind of democracy we have in Canada today. So Mr. Galloway, please accept this on our behalf, and it'll keep you warm through the Canadian winter.
Have to be thick if it's going to keep me warm in the winter, that's for sure. Forgive me while I just open this. How's that? Thank you. Thank you very much, Glenn, for the kind introduction, the last part of which I caught. If I'd caught it all, it would merely have reminded me how very old I'm getting. So the bit that I caught, I think, set the scene for the speech that I wish to make tonight. But first I must thank the church and the authorities of the church and all of you for braving this, well, for me, very cold night in coming to a public meeting. I'm very grateful for it. This is the 11th consecutive speech in 12 days that I have given, travelling huge distances from coast to coast to coast. The reason I'm finding it quite mild here this evening is because it was 37 degrees below on my last gig in Yellowknife near the Arctic Circle, where I discovered many things, not least the presence of 6 Palestinian families there who have now small children born in Yellowknife, about which more later. Every one of these meetings has been absolutely massive, as this one again is this evening, and I'm sure tomorrow afternoon's in Ottawa will be. Which just goes to show that every cloud does indeed have a silver lining. Because, of course, I really shouldn't have been here if it had been left to the government of Mr. Harper and Mr. Kenny. I would not be here. But as any bookseller could have told Mr. Kenny, the book that you try to ban usually ends up on the bestseller list. And we're definitely on the bestseller list. And the story isn't over yet, because although we won a magnificent victory, thanks to a legal team which worked entirely for free and assembled a case against Kenny's slandering of me and his twisting of Canadian law to try to criminalise what is an entirely legitimate strand of thought in Canada and around the world, we still have some distance to travel, and I intend to travel it. You see, what Mr. Kenny said about me could not have been more serious. He said, in public, and repeatedly, and indeed repeated it yesterday, that I was a terrorist, that I was a threat to Canada's national security. Now, it doesn't get much more serious than that. I had sat at the time that he first said it in the mother of all parliaments in Westminster for almost 25 years. It must have come as a surprise to Her Majesty to discover that the Member of Parliament, who'd met her many times in Buckingham Palace, was a secret terrorist, harbouring, bizarrely, a threat to Canada's national security. It must have come as a big surprise to all the speakers of the British Parliament, under whom I had sat, regularly chosen as the Parliamentarian of the Year, as the Parliamentary Debater of the Year, all the while that I was dilating on issues great and small, domestic and international. All the while I was a secret member of a terrorist organisation and plotting one day to visit my wrath on the national security of Canada. It came, I'm sure, as a big surprise to the security services of the United States of America under George W. Bush, because the CIA were ignorant of what Mr. Kenny knew. They allowed me to enter freely and traverse the entire territory of the United States of America, giving speeches at meetings such as this. Mr. Kenny was smarter than the CIA. He knew what they didn't know. And of course, we discovered, after a mighty battle in the courts, that the Canadian security services themselves, in writing, informed Mr. Kenny that both of these allegations were false. In writing, the Canadian security services said that I was not a threat to Canada's national security, and I was not a terrorist. An unremarkable point, but nonetheless, it's come to something when you have a government that has a security service in its employ which tells them that they're telling lies, but the government goes on telling those lies to the public. And that's why I have to say to you that though the offence against me was considerable, the offence against you was much, much more serious. Because what it established, and what Justice Mosley's 60-page caning of Kenny, across a 60-page judgment, what was established was that you have a government of liars and deceivers who are planning to take your rights away, and if that doesn't make you angry, then what are you doing? Of course, it's not over till the fat lady sings, and the fat lady in this question is the grand old lady of Canadian justice. And I have now begun legal action against Jason Kenney, the Canadian government, and their factotums in their political offices, and I'm going to pursue that legal action until I have obtained justice. Now, I know that's a mixed blessing for you as Canadian taxpayers. Mr. Kenney has already cost you a pretty penny in this whole affair, and it's going to cost you a pretty penny more. But here's the good news. Every cent that we raise in compensation from this case will be spent here in Canada building the anti-war movement even bigger and stronger than it currently is. Win-win. I win, you win. The anti-war movement wins. That would be the ultimate justice, wouldn't it, out of this whole affair. Now, I don't want to mislead you. There are limits to freedom of speech. I'm not someone who believes in freedom of speech without limits. There are two limits. One of them is the limit that you may not defame or slander or libel someone in your exercise of your rights of free speech. And slander, defamation, libel can be an expensive business, as Jason Kenney is about to find out. But there is another limit. And that limit is that it is unconscionable to exercise freedom of speech to whip up racial or religious hatred. To whip up hatred against people because of what they are. Not for what they've done, not for what they believe in, but because of who and what they are. That's called racism. And I have, as the introduction I'm sure made clear, been all of my life a man, a boy and man of the left. I joined the Labour Party at the age of 13. At the age of 5, I was handing out leaflets in elections at school gates. I have spent my entire life, which by the grace of God has now been quite a long one, and I have spent that entire political life on the left fighting racism in all its forms. And the idea, which appeared to be one of the reasons why Mr. Kenney banned me from Canada and has been a constant catcall in the media since I arrived, that somehow I might be a hater of Jews, in other words, a racist, is as absurd as it is insulting and offensive. How could somebody like me be against Jews? Marx was a Jew. Trotsky was a Jew. Einstein was a Jew. Epstein was a Jew. Joe Slovo, the leader of the armed forces of the African National Congress, was a Jew. Noam Chomsky is a Jew. There are thousands of Jews in Canada marching with us for Palestinian rights. There are hundreds of thousands of Jews around the world in our campaign for Palestinian rights. I have nothing against Jews, nothing against Judaism. How could I? We are against the racist apartheid ideology of Zionism and its practice in the apartheid state of Israel. That's what we are. When people campaigned to end communism in Russia, it didn't mean they wanted to end the people in Russia. It didn't mean they wanted to eliminate the country of Russia. They were against a political ideology which they believed was wrong and harmful. And that's the spirit in which we say we are against Zionism. We're not against the people, the Jewish people who live in the land they call Israel, we call Palestine. We're against the idea that there can be an apartheid state created there where the non-Jews are second-class citizens and where the state illegally occupies and controls every aspect of the lives of 3 million Palestinian people living under occupation in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in East Jerusalem. About which, more later. Because, apart from the issues of free speech, I have two other tasks this evening. I have to speak about Afghanistan as well as Palestine. And I'm very glad to do so. I see your government has broken yet another promise. They promised you, they promised the families of the Canadian military, they promised the personnel of the Canadian military that they would withdraw them from this doomed and disastrous war in Afghanistan, in which, I don't need to remind you, Canadian blood has been paid in very large measure. In fact, the Canadian military in Afghanistan have lost more blood than any other part of the NATO occupation of that country. As a proportion of the size of your participation in that occupation, Canadian lives and limbs have been lost in wholly disproportionate measure, greater than any other. That was a good reason, along with the overwhelming feeling that exists in Canada, according to the opinion polls, for your government to announce its withdrawal. But that was another promise broken. You're staying, not leaving. In fact, you're staying for another 4 years. But this time, you're only going to be training. Does anyone in Canada ever ask the question, how come the Afghan army needs quite so much training? For 10 years, they've been trained by the occupation armies that invaded and occupied Afghanistan. I'm going to tell you what the budget for training of the Afghan army is. You'll think you've misheard it, so I'll say it twice. The cost of training Hamid Karzai's puppet regime army, paid for by Western taxpayers, including every one of you, is $1 billion per month. $1 billion per month for 10 years has been spent on training the Afghan army with no noticeable improvement in their performance. Nobody's training the Taliban, and they're doing quite well. We're spending $1 billion a month training Karzai's army, even though, according to the United States government, just last month, fully 35% of those trained by us disappear out the back door and join the Taliban, where the wages are apparently higher. Well, you can understand. Once Karzai's had his cut, once his drug-dealing brother has had his cut, once the warlords in the provinces have had their cut, well, there's not much left for the soldiers. So 35% of them disappear and join the Taliban after having been trained at great expense by us. It's reached such a farcical point in Afghanistan, and you really couldn't make this up. If I had written this as a piece of fiction, I would have been accused of fantasy. We're so desperate now to find someone to negotiate with so that we can get out of Afghanistan, that a shopkeeper from Quetta in Pakistan turned up in Afghanistan over the last few months 3 times and claimed to be a leader of the Taliban. We brought him in, we garlanded him, we filled his pockets with approximately $400,000. We gave him diamonds for his 4 wives. We flew him in luxury back and forward from Pakistan to Kabul. He met with General McChrystal, the leader of the NATO armies there. He met, despite denials, with the so-called president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai. He met all and sundry, and he would have kept on going kept on filling his pockets, but someone who knew the person he was claiming to be recognized him and said, "That's not who you think it is." This is a bloody farce. It's good that they're looking to negotiate. It's good that they're looking to end the war. The problem is, first of all, we're negotiating with grocers in Quetta instead of the people who are actually fighting us. We really will have to find out their real names and their real pictures. But the terms on which we will, I promise you, negotiate a withdrawal from Afghanistan are the same terms that were available last year, the year before, or at any point in the war. Which means, I'm sorry to tell you this, I know that it's hurtful to the families of those who've served, still more to the families of those who've lost their loved ones in this conflict, which means that all of these years, all of this treasure, and all of this blood has been absolutely in vain. We could have negotiated our way out of Afghanistan on exactly the terms that we will negotiate our way out of Afghanistan at any time in the course of this last 10 years. Now, time makes it difficult to go into the entire history of Afghanistan. So let me just give you the highlights. The highlight, number one, is that nobody has ever successfully occupied Afghanistan. Even Alexander the Great did not succeed in occupying Afghanistan, and Stephen Harper is not Alexander the Great. The Afghans, as they have proved with every imperial invasion and occupation that there has ever been, from Alexander through the 3 British invasions and occupations in which we lost 10 scores of thousands of soldiers. They were mostly Indian soldiers of the British Empire, and therefore their fate was not quite as important to the British Empire as it might have been. Through the experience of the then USSR, to the now experience of the hundreds of thousands of NATO soldiers who have for 10 years been occupying Afghanistan, the simple truth is this: the Afghans are quite good at fighting. They don't need much training, and they will never accept the foreign occupation of their country. Full stop. And it's about time the military and political leaders in the Western NATO countries acknowledged and accepted this. The Russians lost well over 50,000 dead in their period in Afghanistan, and if we stay, we will continue to lose our soldiers on a daily basis in ever-increasing numbers. And it doesn't matter if you call your soldiers trainers or combatants. It doesn't matter if you're in Kandahar or Kabul. It doesn't matter if you're out in the field or, as Mr. Harper put it, behind a barbed wire fence. There is nowhere safe in Afghanistan for the occupation. And the people who are resisting that occupation will try to kill them. And so the last Canadian death has probably, lamentably, not been seen. If you stay this next 4 years, and it appears that your government is bent that you should, then expect to pay more in blood and treasure in a totally futile war. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm no fan of the Taliban. Even less am I a fan of Al-Qaeda, whom we invaded Afghanistan in the first place to crush. The problem is, Al-Qaeda is no longer in Afghanistan. Bob Woodward, whose access to sources at the very heart of the American state is surely beyond contradiction, in his latest book, Obama's Wars, is oddly specific about this. He says, and I quote him, "There are 45 Al-Qaeda fighters left in Afghanistan." So if there's only 45 of them, how come there's hundreds of thousands of us? And how come their tours of duty are being forever extended? This is actually madness. Not least because our very presence in Afghanistan and the inevitable death and destruction that it causes is actually recruiting support for Al-Qaeda all over the world, including in our own countries. They're always looking for some Muslim cleric to blame, some Islamic organization to ban, some book to blame, some speech by a cleric on YouTube to blame. But it's actually our actions that are radicalizing, fanaticizing, extremizing Muslims all over the world, some of whom are rallying to the banner of the ideas of Al-Qaeda. So actually we're achieving the precise opposite of the purpose that we set out in invading Afghanistan in the first place. And of course, the most bitter irony, and one which is too often forgotten in the West, and younger people here may not even be aware of this. We are punishing the Afghan people now for having had, but no longer having, in their country, a group of fanatics that we sent into their country in the first place. Far too few people ever acknowledge this fact. I know, because of my long life, exactly what happened. I was the one who said in Parliament to Mrs. Thatcher on the night before the collapse of Kabul to the so-called Mujahideen, who included bin Laden and the other Al-Qaeda elements. I said to her, I may be the last man standing in this Parliament ready to say this, but you have opened the gates for the barbarians, and a long dark night will now descend upon the people of Afghanistan. And I never said a truer word. We sent bin Laden. We paid bin Laden. We gave bin Laden the weapons and the political and diplomatic support on the immoral principle that my enemy's enemy is my friend. These people didn't read the novel Frankenstein to the end. They didn't thereby discover that when you create a monster, it finally breaks free from your control. That's why it's called a monster. So we punished the Afghans by sending these people there. Then when those people turned against us, we punished the Afghans again for us having sent them there. How do you think that looks, feels on the Muslim street, amongst the 2 billion Muslims in the world? That hypocrisy, that double standard is part of the reason why we have in the Muslim world a swamp of bitterness and hatred against us, out of which these monsters, bin Ladenism and this extremist Salafist sect has grown ever stronger. We have to get out of Afghanistan, not just because we can't afford it, not just because our own young men are being killed, but because we're achieving precisely the opposite of what needs to be done. We're deepening that swamp instead of draining that swamp. And Wiser Council already know this. That's why we're trying so hard that we're even grabbing shopkeepers from Quetta and filling their pockets with gold. You know, on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, a long struggle in which I, and no doubt many of you, were deeply involved. Mrs. Bush, the wife of George W. Bush, and Mrs. Blair, the wife of Tony Blair, gave a synchronized radio address across the Atlantic. A sort of synchronized swimming in the grief still felt by Americans and indeed all of us about the terrorist atrocity on 9/11. Mrs. Bush and Mrs. Blair invited their audience to remember those heartbreaking messages of love and farewell and grief left from their mobile telephones by those American women on board those aeroplanes hurtling to their deaths. Messages left on the answering machines of their loved ones. They even played some of the actuality. And heartbreaking it was too. But as I said at the time, just because Afghan women, Iraqi women, don't have mobile telephones and their loved ones don't have answering machines, it doesn't make their deaths delivered from the sky any less obscene than the death of those American women on board those airplanes. And of course, everyone acknowledges that, and audiences clap that. But if we search our hearts, we all know that it's not true. We all know that whilst the victims of the terrorist atrocity on 9/11 will never be forgotten, the Afghan and Iraqi and Lebanese and Palestinian victims were never known in order to be forgotten, because their blood is much, much cheaper than the blood of Americans and British and Canadian and Israelis. That's the melancholy truth. Cheaper to us, at least, in the West, but not cheaper in the Muslim world, not cheaper amongst the 2 billion Muslims who know that we don't care about their victims, and which contributes, therefore, to this rage which is present amongst the peoples of the Islamic world, 2 billion strong. This truth must be grasped. You have to be able in this life to empathize. You have to be able to walk in the other person's shoes. When a wedding party in Afghanistan is obliterated from the sky by accident, and huge numbers of Afghan women and children are incinerated by razor-sharp steel, red hot, by sheets of flying glass. It doesn't even make the news in brief in most Western newspapers. No one will ever go there to find the names of the victims, to show you their picture, to show you their weeping relatives. No one will ever even count them, whilst our own deaths are enumerated and explained and mourned and grieved. It's right that they are, but it's our failure to understand that the victims who are Afghans outnumber the victims who are Canadians or British or American by thousands, thousands to one. It's our failure to understand this which is fueling this rage. On the 7th of July 2005, in my own constituency in East London, a terrorist atrocity took place. 7/7, we call it. 55 innocent people were murdered in an act of mass murder. Hundreds were maimed, many of them forever. It was a catastrophe. It happened in the early morning. I myself went to the underground station where one of the underground trains had exploded. I saw the dead and the dying and the broken being carried from the underground by the emergency workers. Statistically, London being London, the vast majority of those victims almost certainly had been opposed to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which the murderers had claimed they were seeking to avenge. Innocent people were killed and maimed as an act of punishment against guilty people none of whom travel on the London Underground. I said in Parliament that afternoon to Mr. Blair, what happened this morning in London was an act of mass murder. Punishing innocent people for the crimes of guilty people is a sin in any religion, a crime in any language. The difference, I said, between me and you is that I'm against it, whether it's carried out by a man with a beard and a turban in the Tora Bora, or a man in a suit in the White House, or Whitehall, or Tel Aviv, or Ottawa, or anywhere else where these dastardly events are planned and executed. But it's their failure to grasp this, you see. It's their belief that it's only terrorism if the other guy does it. If we do it, it's somehow respectable, somehow just collateral damage. People die the same death, being sliced by this red-hot, razor-sharp steel coming from rockets or bombs or explosives in somebody's rucksack. But it's the failure to grasp that amongst huge sections of Western opinion, especially the opinion of the powerful who try to control everyone else's opinion, that fuels this rage. We have but one legitimate demand which we must be ready to enforce with our lives upon Afghanistan. That is the demand that Afghanistan does not again become a base for this Salafist terrorism of the Al-Qaeda variety, which will reach out and hurt the rest of us. That's a legitimate demand. It's one for which I myself am prepared to fight, if necessary, die. But there is no Afghan government at any time in the last decade that would not be prepared to negotiate that with us. The Taliban are not Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda are not in Afghanistan. They're everywhere else. The Taliban are just people who are fighting to get rid of the foreign occupation of their country. And if we end the occupation of their country, we can do so on a guarantee that this will not happen again. That's what we should be concentrating on. Instead, media commentators deliberately conflate these two phenomena. One, Al-Qaeda, is a pan-Islamic group of obscurantists who are ready to strike anyone, anywhere. The Taliban are just guys in sandals in their own country fighting to get foreigners out of their own country. It's not beyond the wit of our diplomats to negotiate a settlement with them. And indeed, we shall have to do so and will do so. That doesn't mean, going back to an interview I did with CBC Radio earlier this evening, that I'm not concerned about what happens in Afghanistan thereafter in terms of their policies. I've always been interested in Afghanistan's internal policies and development. It doesn't mean we shouldn't support movements and struggles for freedom and development in Afghanistan. But that's a different thing from invading them and occupying them. I'm in favour of the municipal councils in Kandahar being elected in free and fair elections by the people of Kandahar, but I'm not prepared to send my own son to die there in order to have it. And neither are most of you, and neither are the political leaders who are sending other people's sons to die there for these things. Blair and Bush and, I dare say, Harper and Kenny are ready to fight to the last drop of other people's blood, and that's just immoral. Now, of all the issues which have deepened this swamp that I talk of all the issues, the preeminent is the one to which I turn now. That is the question of Palestine, which, yes, I have been fighting now for more than 35 years. Palestine is the heart of the matter. It's the flaw at the heart of Western policy towards the East. It's the key to the confrontation between the Muslim and the non-Muslim world. Because you see, there is nowhere, in none of all these crimes I could adumbrate this evening, there is nowhere where our culpability in the suffering of a Muslim, and for that matter, Christian Arab population has suffered any worse than our culpability in Palestine. My own country began it. I'm not responsible for that. I've always, and I come from a very long line of people who hated imperialism and empire. I come from an Irish background. We know a thing or two about the British Empire. Once I came home and told my Irish grandfather that the teacher had said that Britain had an empire so vast that on it the sun never set. And he answered, that's because God would never trust the British in the dark. I never had cause to doubt that. So I'm not myself responsible for it. But my country is. Mr. Balfour, the British Foreign Minister, in an action unique even by imperialist standards, on behalf of one people, the British, promised a second people, the then tiny atheistic Jewish movement called the Zionist movement, the land which belonged to a third people, which Britain, at the point that he made the promise, didn't even occupy as an imperialist power, and of course whose people were never consulted at all. I mention that the Zionists were atheists. I think atheists are wrong, but I have nothing against them. I'm mentioning them as atheists for this reason. Because the Zionist movement, when Balfour made his declaration and his promise, had no particular wish to go to Palestine at all. They had no biblical attachment to Palestine. They didn't believe in the Bible. They were atheists. They negotiated with the British for a white European settler state anywhere. Anywhere. They had, and the records are there, I've seen them with my own eyes, seriously negotiated with the British to take the Seychelles, for example, and to make that Israel. They negotiated with the British taking a part of Uganda and calling that Israel. They negotiated with the British the taking of Patagonia in Latin America and called that Israel. It was only later, much later, to throw sand in the eyes of the Christian fundamentalists, actually, that they developed this biblical case as if God were an estate agent who had promised them this land to the exclusion of the people living on it, who had to be kicked and driven and killed as far away as possible. The British culpability in this catastrophe, or Nakba as it's known in Arabic, is total, as is the culpability of the United States of America, which took over the imperial mantle after the Second World War and the creation of this Zionist state, and who have paid for it, who have armed it, and who have protected it diplomatically and politically ever since. The culpability of the European Union to the crimes committed by this Zionist state is also total. Israel is treated by the European Union as if it were a European country. It trades with the European Union as if it were a member of the European Union, even though its human rights record, its record as a lawbreaker, its record as a breaker of United Nations Security Council resolutions would preclude it ever being admitted to the European Union if it was in Europe. But the culpability doesn't stop there, does it? because you in Canada have now a government which has reduced your country to little more than an embassy of the most extreme Israeli government there has ever been. Mr. Harper boasts that he's ready, no, that you're ready to pay any price. That's what he said. Pay any price to stand shoulder to shoulder with this extremist government of Netanyahu and Lieberman. He could have added Kennedy-esque, bear any burden for Israel. You're already paying that price. Your election to the Security Council of the United Nations ought to have been a foregone conclusion, given Canada's reputation in the world in the past. It was inconceivable you would have been trounced by Portugal in that election. But you were trounced, as Mr. Harper himself conceded. You paid the price for standing inseparably, shoulder to shoulder with the government of Israel. He said, this is a badge of honor. I say it's a badge of shame. And either way, it's not a price that you should be prepared to pay. Because you see, these double standards over what's called Israel or Palestine, depending on your point of view, are now so brazen that most people don't even notice them. Let's take the nuclear question. Iran, which doesn't have any nuclear weapons, is being sanctioned and threatened openly with war, invasion, occupation, regime change over the nuclear question, even though it doesn't have any nuclear weapons, has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, allows inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency to enter their country at will and to any facility. Iran, which is policed by the IAEA, whose chief said, and I quote, "There is no evidence that Iran is seeking to build a nuclear weapon." But Israel, on the other hand, has hundreds of nuclear weapons, illegally acquired, undeclared to the international community. Israel refuses to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, would never dream of allowing the IAEA's inspectors to come to Dimona, where their nuclear weapons are, hundreds of them, and we only know this because the brave Jew Mordechai Vanunu, who worked there, went to prison for 20 years for telling us this truth. But the IAEA, nor the Security Council, nor anyone else has ever demanded the inspection of Israel's nuclear firepower. Why? Because there's one law for Israel and one law for everybody else. Let's look at the aid ship, of which I was a co-organizer on the 31st of May of this year. In international waters, in an act of brazen piracy, in international waters, heavily armed Israeli commandos boarded an aid ship filled with unarmed people and murdered 9 of them, wounded scores of them, kidnapped hundreds of them, whom they took in chains to a prison camp in the Negev desert, where they proceeded to rob them of every single last piece of their possessions, their mobile phones, their computers, which ended up on sale in a market in Jerusalem, their money, their clothes, their pajamas, their underwear, everything was stolen by the people who had kidnapped them. Just substitute the word Iran for Israel in what I've just said. If Iran had boarded in international waters an aid ship, killed 9, wounded scores, kidnapped hundreds, robbed them, you'd already be wearing tin hats because we'd already be at war with Iran. But Israel committed this crime. The United Nations set up a tribunal to investigate it. The tribunal denounced Israel's actions in the most withering terms and promptly buried the report. Like all the other reports, no one will ever punish Israel for that crime. Indeed, President Obama has just promised Israel that he will veto any attempt to bring this matter up in the Security Council and give them another $1.7 billion worth of military hardware if they'll only, please, for just 90 days, agree to stop committing the crime under international law of building illegal settlements on Palestinian land. And Netanyahu's government's refused. Imagine what the price of an actual Palestinian state would have to be if for that price they will not even freeze settlement activity for 90 days. Iraq was broken on the wheel of sanctions, invasion and occupation because we were told of the inviolability of United Nations Security Council resolutions. It was intolerable, Bush and Blair said, that anyone can be allowed to defy the United Nations. Even though it turned out Iraq wasn't defying the United Nations at all and didn't, as they said they didn't, have weapons of mass destruction. But Israel has broken more United Nations resolutions than all the countries of the world put together. But she's never punished. Instead, she's endlessly rewarded. Let's take the example of the one with which in the last 2 years I have been most closely involved. Before I tell you the situation in Gaza, I've said this 10,000 times, let me make it 10,001. I am not now, nor have I ever been, a supporter of Hamas. As a matter of fact, I support an entirely different group of Palestinians altogether. If I had a vote in the elections in Palestine, which I don't, it wouldn't have been for them, and it wouldn't now be for them. I'm not a supporter of Hamas. It doesn't matter how many times these raving bloggers in Canada or these raving ministers in Ottawa contend it. The judge has already opined on this point, and his decision is final. I am not a supporter of Hamas, but I am a supporter of democracy. And the only people entitled to choose the leadership of the Palestinian people are the Palestinian people themselves. This is surely ABC. I mean, how else could it be? I don't like Stephen Harper. I wouldn't have voted for him. But I can't pretend that he's not the Prime Minister of Canada. I can't appoint somebody else as the Prime Minister of Canada, though the vision of Michael Ignatieff just flitted across my mind. Talk about Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Cheeks of the same backside. I can't appoint Ignatieff or Layton or anyone else as the leader of Canada. I have to accept the outcome of the elections in Canada. Well, as we say we're fighting for democracy every time we go to war, the Palestinians had democracy. They had an election. It was the only free democratic election ever held in any Arab country ever in all history. It was described by Jimmy Carter, no less, as pristine. Pristine. crystal clear, transparent, perfect. We just didn't like the result. So what did we do? We immediately imposed a siege to starve the children of the voters, to punish them for how their parents had voted. How democratic is that? That's hypocrisy, not democracy. But that's exactly what we did, and that siege has now lasted for 4 long years. Now, 80% of the people of Gaza are refugees. That means they're entitled to the protection of the international community. 80% of the Palestinians in Gaza are unemployed. It's a magic number. 80% of the Palestinians in Gaza are living on $1 a day. And 80% of their children are either, according to the United Nations Commission for Children, malnourished or undernourished. What are we doing about it? Well, in your case, you're supporting it. Canada has supported this siege from the first day and continues to support it. Even though it was imposed for no other reason. It wasn't about rockets. It wasn't about charters. Google it and see. It was immediately imposed when Hamas won the election in Palestine. And of course, not content with merely starving, not content with merely besieging, for 22 days, from the 27th of December 2008, the world watched silently as something that hasn't been seen in this world since the end of the Second World War took place. 1.6 million Palestinians living in what David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, called an open-air prison camp, were locked up. All the gates were locked. Nowhere to run to. Nowhere to hide. And death and destruction was rained down upon their heads for 22 days and nights. 1,416 Palestinians were killed. Most of them were women and children. Most of them were civilians. These weapons, from land, sea and air, killed 1,400 Palestinians and wounded thousands more. Ambulances were deliberately attacked and destroyed, and the personnel murdered inside them. But not content with having locked up more than 1.5 million people so you could kill them, they even rained down illegal, banned weapons upon them. Only one of which I have time to deal with now. If you were not dependent on CNN or Fox or Sky, you may have seen this for yourselves. White phosphorus gas dropped from airplanes on 1.6 million people locked up for the duration. Do you know about white phosphorus gas? Imagine a state, though we don't accept this nomenclature, but calling itself the Jewish state, dropping gas on people in an open-air prison camp. I know all about white phosphorus gas because I happened to be in Beirut in 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon, swept through the south, surrounded the capital Beirut, began systematically to reduce it to rubble and ash. I went to the hospitals and saw the victims, mainly children, of white phosphorus gas. They were breathing white smoke out of their noses and their mouths, which they would continue to do until they died. Because that's what you do with white phosphorus, you see. When you breathe it in, you can't get it out. it cooks you to death from the inside. The body literally bakes to death. There is no treatment. There is no antidote. There is nothing that you can do. And I saw them. I watched the children dying with this smoke coming out of their mouths and their noses. I never thought that I would ever see it on television because, of course, back in 1982, the media was much less able to report these things than it currently is. But there, during those 22 days, I, and I hope you, watched this gas falling amongst the people with exactly the same result. You may have seen, as I did, the area of Zaytun on the edge of Gaza City, absolutely leveled by the invaders of the so-called Israel, so-called Defense Force, which reduced to absolute rubble this entire area. One family alone lost 35 members of their family in Zaytun. Israel refused to allow the surviving ambulance personnel to go into the destruction for 5 long days and nights. Wounded and dying people were crying out for help until they could cry out no more. One little baby in Zaytun was found dead, sucking on the toe of her dead mother. I have spoken with the family of that child. I have spoken with the family of the child whose picture became famous throughout the world. When the ambulance man finally got to her, he held up her little body burned to a crisp, minus her legs, which had been eaten off by the dogs roaming the destruction, the killing fields of Gaza. I myself interviewed a little girl. Here I'm addressing the Muslim and Arab people in the audience particularly. I interviewed a little girl aged 11 who had been staying with her grandmother when she got the news that her house had been hit by a rocket. She raced with her grandmother to the scene to discover that her mother and her father and all 5 of her brothers had been killed. She was now an orphan with only an elderly grandmother in the world. I spoke to this little girl, and this is what she said. Where is this great Arab world that they teach us about in school? Where is this ummah that they teach us about in school? Why did they leave us alone to face this? What did we do to deserve to be left alone to face this? I had no answer for the girl. I don't suppose you do either. But one thing is true, that if the silence at best, complicity in the case of Canada and the United States at worst, was bad enough, the pitiful, miserable, unspeakable silence and paralysis of the Arab regimes and the Muslim world in the face of this great crime. No words, and I'm good with words, no words that I can find can sum up my feelings or that girl's feelings about them. What I did say to the girl was that I would try to find brothers for her. I would try to find parents for her. I would try to find people all over the world that would not let her face this alone. The Viva Palestina convoys, 5 of which have now entered Gaza, delivering millions of dollars worth of medical and humanitarian assistance, and taken hundreds, now more than 1,000 people into the territory to show the world that this siege continues, is something of which I am proud. Jason Kenney thinks it means I'm a terrorist. That's what the documents say. I delivered ambulances and wheelchairs and baby milk and humanitarian assistance to people who'd been massacred, people who'd been besieged because of how they voted. If that's terrorism, you are bankrupting the word of all meaning. You are usurping the meaning of the language itself. What word are you going to use for real terrorism if delivering ambulances to such people can be thus described? I close with this point because this is the unkindest cut of all. This is the insult which is added to the injury of having your country wiped off the map, having your people scattered to the four corners of the earth, even to the Arctic Circle in Yellowknife, without passports, without papers, without status, massacred, driven from pillar to post. The insult that's added to all that injury is that the Palestinians, who are the victims of terrorism, are called the terrorists, and those responsible for the terrorism visited upon them are called the victims of terrorism. This injustice, this double standard, is driving people mad with rage everywhere in the world. We all have to drain this swamp of hatred. If our countries, if our governments won't do it, we have to do it. Wassalamu alaikum. Thank you very much.
Before we move to the question and answer period, and there will be an opportunity for question and answers, and ask you all to stay, I'd like to ask Julie Gard, coordinator of the Labor Studies program at the U of M, to come forward, because there's another important part to this meeting, and she's going to speak to that, and it's a further funding appeal.
Well, we've just heard, we've been reminded about the unspeakable atrocities and the profound lack of social justice that within which we live every day. That, unfortunately, is the time in which we exist. However, best remedy for the kind of depression that we feel when we face this kind of, we feel unable to respond, and there's nothing maybe that we can do, but I have a simple and easy way that all of you can make a real difference. You can help bring peace and security to the people of Palestine and Afghanistan. You contributed at the door, and that was important. The money that we raised at the door will have to pay the costs of George Galloway's tour, as he said, a very extensive tour, 11 cities, 12 speaking engagements, and also to help fund Peace Alliance Winnipeg, the organization, one of the organizations for which we can thank for tonight's speaker. Sorry, I was overcome. This was a very rousing speech, and it's very upsetting to be reminded of all these terrible things. This appeal is distinct from that. The funds raised that I'm going to ask you to contribute to tonight will go to two other causes. One is the Canadian boat to Gaza, and the other is humanitarian aid to the people of Afghanistan. The Canadian boat to Gaza is an international, non-violent campaign to bring humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. We hope to raise $300,000 to send a Canadian boat filled with much-needed humanitarian aid. And as you know, these are supplies that are desperately needed by the people of Palestine. And this is a very important initiative in more than one way. It also helps to bring the other other way that we will use the money that you will contribute tonight to provide humanitarian aid for Afghanistan. The object of this appeal is the money is going to go to a credible, effective, grassroots humanitarian organization that is untainted by government corruption. And the choice of this organization is being debated, but it will be announced when we're ready to send the check. I hope that you will find it in yourselves tonight to be generous. It's one of the few things that we can do, but we can do that because that's what we have. You know, we are the part of the world that has financial resources, and you know, we can share those resources. Your generosity makes a difference in two ways. One, of course, is the obvious way, which is that it will bring humanitarian assistance to people who are struggling against war and occupation. And that's very important work, as it makes a huge difference in people's lives. But the other way that it makes a difference is that it will set an example to our governments, federal and provincial, that they cannot ignore. That this in turn will weaken their efforts to continue their support for the oppressive governments of Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamid Karzai. So you do both things. You help the people in Afghanistan and Palestine, and you also signal very clearly to our governments that we do not agree with these policies. We are not on board with what they're doing. And we want to make a very strong statement to say, no, you don't speak in our name. We said we have a different view. This is what we believe in. So I'm going to ask that you express both those sentiments very clearly and dig as deeply as you can and contribute to these very important causes. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to disappoint you because not only don't I have a solution to the fundamental problems of Afghanistan, I don't believe that it's my duty to solve them. It's my duty to support you to solve them. It's my duty to support the Afghan people to solve them. But we can't spend, as we are, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars on one country. Someone had an article yesterday when I was in Edmonton. I wish I'd brought it with me. He compared and contrasted the money that we've spent on this war in Afghanistan with what we spend on the elimination of malaria or food poverty, fuel poverty, and mass immiseration in many parts of the world, many of which could actually have been eliminated completely from the earth for a mere fraction of the money that's been spent on Afghanistan. So it's all become completely disproportionate. We can't go on giving to Afghanistan the amount of money that we're giving to Afghanistan, neither to fill Karzai's pocket, nor to feed and pay for the military, nor for anything else, because we have a big wide world full of problems. So I feel for you very much. I not only am I in favor of women's rights, for example, in Afghanistan, I was a supporter of the only government in the whole history of Afghanistan that ever did anything for women. That was the government that Reagan and Thatcher sent bin Laden to destroy. So I'm entirely with you, and I'll give you all of my political effort. But I won't send my son to die there for your rights. And I won't ask the public around the world to go on spending hundreds of billions of dollars in your country. I can't justify that. So what I'm really saying is, what happens in Afghanistan after we withdraw from it will have to be resolved by the Afghan people themselves. They are not children. They are not minors. They don't need geniuses like Bush and others to tell them how to live and how to organize themselves. And we will all have our favorites in Afghanistan, and we might all, as political activists, want to support them in one way or another, but not by military means and not by occupation. To the gentleman who said he was on a terrorist list, I better stay well clear of you then, because I've only just got in myself. You don't look like a terrorist to me, but I don't know you. I can't comment on whether other people are terrorists or not without knowing their cases. But I do know that I'm not a terrorist. And may I say to the representative of the Canadian Security Services in the room, if they would like to identify themselves, I could thank them in person. I do believe that it is creditable that they, in writing, told Jason Kenney that his 2 reasons for banning me from Canada were false. And that evidence, which we uncovered only after a huge fight, was, I think, very persuasive in the Canadian courts. When I was banned, Kenney said, he's not getting in, and that's that. And I said on television that night, on Canadian television that night, that is not that. Canada is a country still governed by laws, and not by the whims of here today, gone tomorrow, I hope gone tomorrow, politicians. So I'm grateful to the judiciary for the way in which they overturned this ban, and I hope that they will smile on my 3 actions which will follow.